I'm Kevin Anderson. I'm the pastoral intern here at Love of Christ Lutheran Church. I will be preaching this Sunday, this 20th Sunday after Pentecost. And today we're going to take a closer look at our gospel text, which comes from the 10th chapter of Mark. Just a little bit of background before we get into our text. It helps us kind of frame these stories a little bit better. So Mark can be broken up into three parts. You have Jesus in Galilee. And then you have Jesus journeying to Jerusalem. And then finally we have Jesus in Jerusalem. And so our gospel text for this week falls toward the tail end of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. He's on his way. He's told the disciples what is going to happen to him. Peter professes him as Messiah. And Jesus shares with them what that means. That means that he's going to be rejected, suffer, and he will ultimately die on the cross and be resurrected. And Mark's gospel is kind of interesting. It's more condensed than the other gospels. And there's this unfolding of who the Messiah is that is present throughout the book of Mark, where Mark doesn't interject his own opinions along the way. So we get these stories and we're left to wrestle with who is this Messiah that we get. And you're going to hear that in the text. Jesus is being tested again, and people are trying to figure out who he is. And some of those questions and testing is done in a way that is not very nice. That's to say that very nicely. They're trying to figure out if Jesus is who he says he is. What kind of teacher is he? And some of this testing is done as a means to make Jesus stumble, make him say something wrong so that they can out him as not who he claims to be. And so we're going to hear some more of that in a bit of a challenging text again this morning. So just some build up for our text. The transfiguration is happening, has already happened. Jesus continues to heal people. There's another foretelling of Jesus' death and resurrection. The disciples fight on who is the greatest. There's an exorcism. And then we heard this past Sunday about hell and what it means to be salt, that Jesus calls us to be. So this is all kind of leading up to what transpires in the text for this Sunday. Let's take a look at the text. Some testing him asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house with the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." People were bringing children to him in order that he might touch them, and the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the children come to me. Do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of heaven as a little child will never enter it." And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. We get a lot in this text. And one of the questions I've been wrestling with is, why this question? Why this question, Jesus? Why is Jesus tested with this question on divorce? And there's a few things to say. The first is that divorce was an unsettled topic culturally. And what I mean by that is you have rabbis and schools of thought within the Jewish community on Moses' teaching found in Deuteronomy chapter 24 that speak directly to divorce. And that's what Jesus brings up here in the first part of our gospel text when he's asked the question, is it lawful? And so Jesus is giving an answer, and he's addressing the lawful question that is asked to him. And he does it in a very interesting way. And again, this is kind of this testing of who are you, Jesus? What are you going to say? How can we frame you, Jesus, negatively? All of that is kind of tied into this question. And so Jesus does a really, really kind of controversial, interesting thing in this story. On the one hand, he presents what we heard in Genesis chapter 2 in the other study, where you have this ideal image of what it would be like for a man and a woman to be together as God originally intended. And then he says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses writes you a command. And that tells us that divorce has been a part of the human story for a long time, right? If the laws that were written in Deuteronomy came about around the year 600 BCE, and Jesus is still getting this question today, there is still kind of this unsettled nature about how exactly do we deal with broken relationships? How do we deal with the reality that we have good intentions, we enter things faithfully, and it doesn't work out for us? And Jesus' answer to that pushes us toward a bigger picture. And so it's very interesting here that Jesus says right there in that line, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. So on the one hand, you're getting in Jesus' original answer an answer to the question. You're getting the law. The law says, do this. This is the ideal. And then on the other side of this, you're getting this answer that points us to something much larger than divorce. And that's adultery. And Jesus' answer here is a direct tie to the Ten Commandments. And so Jesus' answer, while it is in the context of divorce, points us to the reality of broken relationships, broken covenant, right? Who among you, who amongst us, can fulfill the Ten Commandments on their own? And the answer, of course, is no one. And so in a way, I think Jesus is pointing the disciples and us to himself. Who is the one that can stand in the midst of the broken reality that we live in? Who is the one who can fill the void of sin in the world? And while that answer isn't given explicitly to us in the verses that we have in front of us, it's important for us to frame Jesus' answers, Jesus' story, in light of all of Jesus' story. And what I mean by that is, if we leave this text alone and try to make a moral code out of it, this is all we get of Jesus. I think we missed some things that Jesus has for us, although it's a pretty good response in terms of it. His response pushes us towards the Ten Commandments, and everyone is convicted of failing the Ten Commandments, right? So is this really about divorce? For Jesus, I'm not so sure. I think Jesus points us to the larger reality of the broken nature of humanity, and ultimately leaves us with the question of who can stand in for us in the midst of this broken world. Ultimately, that is Jesus. So if we leave this verse on its own and make a moral code, a moral law out of it, we're left without the death and resurrection of Jesus, the fulfillment of what is to come. And Martin Luther tells us that the Bible is the cradle that holds Jesus. So for Lutherans, as we read texts, we are constantly looking for Jesus to be present. And I think we have to do that even with Jesus' own words. We have to read them in light of the whole story that God has for us through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And if you think about the gospel text last week, right? If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. Well, here we are with our eyes and our hands, the majority. And if those things are removed, it's not necessarily because of a sin that we committed or that we felt that we were going to commit, but they're removed for medical reasons. So if we only take Jesus' words in that section for what they are, we don't frame them in light of the whole story of what Jesus is going to do on the cross and in his resurrection, then we miss the larger story of the reconciliation of our own brokenness in the world. And that doesn't mean that we're going to wake up tomorrow and there's going to be no more divorces in the world. Because clearly this is a reality for Jesus, clearly this was a reality for Moses, and clearly this is going to be a part of our reality. Now I think what is very important for us is this last section of verses. And this is where Jesus is dealing with the children. It's the last line there. And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. This is how God views us. This is how God views us in the midst of our broken relationships, in our own failures, in our own lacking. Despite all of that, Jesus is with children in all of their dirtiness. And some may even have fleas. Some have boogers coming out of their nose. Some are crying. Some are screaming, yelling. They're children being children. And yet still, in all of their messiness, he takes them up in his arms, lays his hands on them, and blesses them. So for us, if we're children of divorce, if we've been divorced, if we have family members who are divorced, if we have friends who have divorced, this is a part of the world that we live in. And yet still, in the midst of the broken reality that we are part of, God is the one taking us up in God's arms, laying his hands on us and blessing us. I encourage you to think more deeply on that as we get ready to worship this Sunday. Blessings to you.